Concarpike Airfield, Normandy, the 7th of November, 1943, mid-afternoon. The weather over the Channel has turned. Low gray cloud stacked on low gray cloud, and a headwind is blowing in off the Atlantic at more than 100 miles an hour. A lone American fighter drops out of that cloud, wheels down, engine throttled back, looking for a place to land. The pilot is Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, flying a P-47D Thunderbolt named Beetle. A few hours earlier, he had climbed out of England as part of an escort for a formation of B-26 Marauders bound for German airfields at Montdidier and Moulins. The bombing went as planned. The flight home did not. Somewhere over the Channel, a headwind of more than 100 miles an hour has eaten fuel his charts did not budget for, and the weather has erased every landmark he was trained to navigate by. His instruments are telling him what his fuel gauge already knows, that he does not have enough left to find England. Below him, through a gap in the cloud, he sees a runway. He takes it to be a friendly field on the Sussex coast. He lowers his gear, lines up, and lands his airplane, tail down, engine still running, on an airfield he believes is his own. It is not his own. It is Concarpike, a Luftwaffe fighter station in occupied Normandy, and the men running toward his aircraft across the wet concrete are not in British battle dress. Roach realizes it in the seconds after his wheels touch down, watching the uniforms close in, watching the rifles come up. He is taken prisoner on his own runway, in his own cockpit, before the propeller has fully stopped turning. Pause on that sentence. An American fighter pilot, flying one of the most formidable machines the United States has built for this war, has just handed it to the enemy intact, undamaged, fully fueled with what fuel he had left, because a headwind and a bank of cloud made Normandy look like Sussex. William Roach will spend the rest of the war behind wire, at Stalag Luft 1 on the Baltic coast. His airplane will not sit still for a single day of it. This is not a story about a navigation error over the Channel. This is a story about what happens when a nation that has told itself a comfortable story about its enemy is handed undamaged on a plate the one piece of physical evidence that could prove the story wrong. It is a story about a test pilot who read that evidence honestly, and about a captured aircraft that did something the last captured aircraft on this channel did not manage to do. This time, they listened. This is the story of the Beetle, and of Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, and of what he found when he took a captured Thunderbolt into the German sky. Part 1. To understand what the Luftwaffe believed about American fighters in November 1943, you have to understand what German industrial culture had spent a decade telling itself. Germany's aviation establishment in the 1930s and early 1940s regarded the United States as a nation of assembly lines, of Ford and General Motors, immensely productive but, in the German telling, uncreative. American cars were cheap and plain. American consumer goods were mass-produced for a market that valued convenience over craftsmanship. It followed, in the logic of men who had built the Bf-109 and the FW-190 as precision instruments refined over years of racing pedigree and fighter doctrine, that American fighter aircraft would be the same: functional, overbuilt, unsophisticated, numerous but not dangerous in the ways that mattered. This was not simple arrogance. Early encounters with American fighters over North Africa and the Mediterranean had done little to disturb it. The P-40 was outclassed by the 109, and everyone on the German side knew it. When German pilots first heard descriptions of a new American fighter, enormous, over 7 tons loaded, powered by a single huge radial engine, they filed it under the same heading: a big, heavy, unwieldy machine, something a nation of refrigerator makers would build when asked to build a fighter. Some German pilots who saw it from a distance called it, half admiringly, half contemptuously, a flying barrel. This is the same institution, the same test center, that 3 years earlier had turned away Werner Molders's honest report on a captured Spitfire. Rechlin, on the Mecklenburg Lakes, 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin, was where the Luftwaffe brought every captured enemy machine to be measured against its own aircraft. It had the instruments, the strain gauges, the qualified pilots, and, in the case of the Spitfire, it had also had the institutional will to file an inconvenient truth and move on. The men who ran Rechlin in November 1943 were 3 years further into a war that had stopped going the way anyone in Berlin had promised. Their fighter force was fighting a two-front air war it had not been built for, against a heavy bomber offensive by day and by night that showed no sign of slowing. Whether Rechlin would treat this new American arrival the same way it had treated the Spitfire, filed, ignored, forgotten, was not yet decided. It would depend on one man's willingness to write down what he actually found, and on whether anyone with the authority to act on it happened to be paying attention this time. Rechlin in 1943 was busier than it had ever been. Captured Lancasters, flying fortresses, Liberators, Mosquitoes, and Mustangs all passed through its hangars in these years, alongside Soviet Yaks and Lavochkins brought back from the Eastern Front, each one stripped, weighed, and flown against the clock by the same small pool of test pilots. The Thunderbolt was one machine in a long queue of enemy hardware waiting to be understood. What made it different was not the runway it landed on. It was the man who happened to be free to fly it that week, and what he chose to write down afterward. Part 2. Before you can understand what Lerche found in the cockpit, you have to understand why the aircraft was built the shape it was, because the shape itself was the first thing German engineers got wrong about it. The Thunderbolt came out of Republic Aviation on Long Island, New York, designed by Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant engineer who had fled the Russian Revolution as a young man, partnered with fellow émigré Alexander D. Seversky, and built a career in American aviation from nothing. Kartveli's problem in 1940 was not how to build a fast, light interceptor for defending a coastline. It was how to build an escort fighter that could climb to 25,000 feet or higher and still fight effectively at that altitude, over Europe, thousands of miles from home. The answer he reached for was a turbo supercharger, a technology the United States had been quietly refining since research begun in the First World War by an engineer named Sanford Moss, work originally aimed at helping aircraft engines breathe at the thin air of high-altitude reconnaissance flights. A turbo supercharger is not a small thing to bolt onto an engine. It needs ducting to carry hot exhaust gas the length of the fuselage to spin a turbine, and it needs room for an intercooler to cool the compressed air before it reaches the cylinders. Kartveli built the airframe around that plumbing rather than in spite of it, and the result was a fighter shaped like nothing else in the sky. A deep, barrel-like fuselage housing a Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double WASP radial engine, and behind the cockpit, the ductwork that let that engine make its full rated power 5 miles above the ground, at altitudes where German engines were already gasping for air. American pilots called it the Jug, short, depending on who told the story, for juggernaut, or simply for its shape. German observers, seeing only the bulk and none of the reasoning behind it, called it clumsy. They were about to find out how wrong that judgment was. Kartveli himself would go on after the war to draw the Republic F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunderchief for the jet age, and would die in 1974, still regarded as one of American aviation's most underrated designers. A reputation his first Thunderbolt had done a great deal in November 1943 to earn without his ever knowing it. Part 3. The aircraft that dropped out of the cloud over Concarpike had been in American service for less than a year. Serial number 42-22490, radio code YF-U, nicknamed Beetle by its ground crew, it was one of hundreds of P-47Ds that had begun arriving in England through 1943 to escort the growing daylight bombing campaign against occupied Europe and, before long, Germany itself. William Roach was not a veteran. The mission that put him down at Caen was among his early operational sorties, and the error that followed was the kind inexperienced pilots make in bad weather over open water. A headwind underestimated, a fix on the wrong coastline, a runway mistaken for home. It cost him his freedom for the rest of the war. It cost the United States one intact, undamaged first-line fighter aircraft, handed to the enemy with a full instrument panel and a logbook still in the map case. The Luftwaffe did not waste the gift. Ground crews at Caen secured the aircraft within hours. It had come down with its engine and airframe essentially undamaged, a rare thing for a captured fighter, most of which arrived shot up, burned, or broken across a field. Where minor parts were needed, the Germans had an unusual convenience close to hand. Within days, a second P-47 from Roach's own squadron went down nearby, and components from it were used to bring Beetle up to full flying condition. A small, almost absurd detail. One squadron's misfortune completing another aircraft from the same unit for the enemy's use. By the 14th of November, 1 week after Roach's landing, the aircraft was at Rechlin, repainted in Luftwaffe markings, issued a Luftwaffe test code, and scheduled for full trials, performance, armament, handling. It was, for the purposes of the men who would fly it, no longer an American fighter. It was a question that needed an honest answer. Part 4. The man who took that question into the air was Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, Recklin's principal test pilot, 29 years old, and by November 1943, already one of the most experienced men in the world at doing exactly this job. Over the course of the war, Lerche would fly more than 120 different aircraft types. A great many of them captured Allied machines: Spitfires, Hawker Tempests, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, a captured Soviet Yak-3, and Lavochkin La-5, and later a captured P-51 Mustang as well. He was not a fighter ace with a grudge to settle in the cockpit. He was closer to an engineer who happened to fly, a man whose job was to come back from every flight with numbers and honest judgment rather than a reputation to defend. That distinction matters because it is the same distinction that made Mulders's Spitfire report worth reading and, in its time, worth ignoring. Recklin's test pilots were, on the whole, professionals first. What varied was whether Berlin wanted to hear what they had to say. Lerche's report on the captured Thunderbolt, preserved in the flight test records that later formed the basis of his post-war memoir, described an aircraft that did not fit the story German aviation had told itself. The Thunderbolt was enormous, the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter of the war by a wide margin, its engine fed by that turbo-supercharger and its structure carrying 8 50-caliber machine guns, more forward firepower than any German fighter mounted, along with armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that let it absorb damage a 109 or a 190 would not survive. American pilots already knew this from hard experience. Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, flying a Thunderbolt over France that same year, took more than 100 rounds of machine gun fire and roughly 20 cannon strikes from a German ace's Focke-Wulf in a single engagement, and still flew the wreck home and landed it. Lerche, flying the machine himself rather than reading about it, found it heavy and unresponsive at low speed, ill-suited to a tight-turning fight at low altitude, exactly the kind of combat German fighter doctrine was built around. But at height, in a dive, and at maximum boost, he found it formidable, an aircraft that could outdive almost anything in the sky, and that used its weight, the very quality German engineers had mocked from a distance, as a weapon rather than a liability. A version of his verdict has circulated online in recent years as a single, tidy quotation, that the Americans had not built a crude aircraft, but a practical one. That precise sentence cannot be verified against Lerche's own published account, and this channel does not put words in a dead man's mouth that he may not have written. What his own record does support, clearly and repeatedly, is the substance behind it. Not a copy of a European fighter, not a crude machine, but a purpose-built answer to a different set of problems. High-altitude endurance, structural toughness, and a dive that German fighters could not follow into the ground without risking their own airframes. Part 5. What happened next is where this story stops rhyming with Mulders and the Spitfire. In the summer of 1940, an honest report on a captured enemy fighter went to Ernst Udet's office in Berlin and was filed. In November 1943, the captured Thunderbolt did not go quietly into a filing cabinet. It went to war, on the German side, flying with a unit that existed for exactly this purpose. Circus Rosarius, formerly the 2nd Squadron of the Luftwaffe High Command's experimental unit, had been formed earlier that year by Major Theodor Rosarius with a single job: to take captured Allied aircraft repainted in German crosses on a traveling circuit of frontline fighter wings so that ordinary Luftwaffe pilots could see the enemy up close, in the air, flown by one of their own. Given the Luftwaffe code T9 plus FK, Beetle was flown from airfield to airfield across occupied France and the Reich, typically 5 or 6 captured types touring together, spending several days at each fighter wing, units like Jagdgeschwader 1, so pilots could watch it perform, ask questions of the men who flew it, and in some cases sit in the cockpit themselves. This was not an academic exercise. Fighter wings defending the Reich by late 1943 were increasingly meeting American Thunderbolts, and before long Mustangs as well, on almost every mission, and the pilots doing the meeting were, more and more, teenagers with a fraction of the flying hours their predecessors had logged 3 years earlier. Circus Rosarius existed to compress years of tactical experience into a week on the ground. Do not try to turn with a Thunderbolt at low speed and low altitude. That is the one fight it will not win against a 109 or a 190. But do not try to outdive one either, because the weight that makes it clumsy in a turn makes it nearly untouchable going downhill. Aim for the parts of the airframe that were not built to absorb punishment, because the parts that were, the engine, the tanks, the pilot's seat, would shrug off hits that ended a German fighter in a single burst. This was Lerche's flight, translated into a briefing a 19-year-old lieutenant could use before his next scramble. Part 6. It would be a comfortable ending to say that this lesson, learned and taught while the Mulders report gathered dust 3 years earlier, turned the tide of the air war over Germany. It did not, and honesty requires saying so. The tactics Zirkus Rosarius taught were sound, and pilots who absorbed them lived a little longer than pilots who did not. But tactics fight symptoms, not causes. And the cause working against the German fighter force by early 1944 was arithmetic that no amount of correct doctrine could fix. American fighter groups flying Thunderbolts, soon joined by Mustangs with drop tanks that could reach Berlin and beyond, were no longer a nuisance at the Channel coast. They were an escort that could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. And every German fighter that rose to meet the bomber stream now had to survive the fighter as well. Through Big Week in February 1944 and the months that followed, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force bled experienced pilots at a rate its training pipeline could not replace, a collapse that historians have called, without much exaggeration, a graveyard for a generation of German fighter pilots. Zirkus Rosarius made individual young men better at surviving an encounter with a Thunderbolt. It could not make there be fewer Thunderbolts, and by the summer of 1944, there were thousands of them, flown increasingly by Americans, with more training and more fuel than the men rising to meet them. What the Beatles story does prove, cleanly, is narrower and in some ways more interesting than a single turning point in the war. It proves that Rechlin and the wider Luftwaffe test establishment had learned something between 1940 and 1943 about what to do with an honest test pilot's report. Mulders wrote the truth about the Spitfire, and it went nowhere near a German cockpit that mattered. Lerche wrote the truth about the Thunderbolt, and within weeks of his flight, it was airborne over a dozen fighter fields, teaching men who needed the lesson before their next mission, not their next promotion board. William Roach spent the rest of the war at Stalag Luft 1 on the Baltic coast near Bart, alongside thousands of other captured American airmen, until Soviet forces reached the camp in the last weeks of the war in Europe. He came home. Hans-Werner Lerche kept flying captured aircraft for Rechlin until the war's end, adding B-17s, B-24s, a Soviet Yak-3, a Lavochkin LA-5, and the P-51 Mustang to a logbook that would eventually list more than 120 types. He survived the war, and more than 3 decades later, in 1977, published his own account of it as Luftwaffe Test Pilot, translated into English in 1980, one of the few first-hand records of what it actually felt like to sit in the enemy's machine and tell your own side.